So something serious continues to brew on NATO's eastern flank. Russian jets crossing once again into a NATO member's airspace, this time Estonia. Now on the surface, many of you may well just say, well, that's classic Putin's playbook. But the reality is, an emphasis is that this is about a far bigger question. How committed is NATO to actually responding, to show deterrence and an effective, defense of itself, but also physically the Baltic states' eastern flank of Europe? Because if Article 5, NATO's mutual defence clause, can't be trusted to actually be followed through on, then the whole alliance seems rather irrelevant, perhaps even unravelling. So in this video, I wanted to explore a little bit more about what's going on from a critical lens on NATO's eastern front, why Russia is probing so aggressively now, whether the West would actually fight for, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and specifically what force, politics, and strategy really look like when the chips are down. Do stay tuned, because there's some points I think you might not have considered.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel where we are returning to Russia, but its relationship this time with NATO and the continued provocations, escalations that we're seeing on its eastern flank. Now, to set the scene, we have to understand that NATO's official line is clear. It will defend every inch of its territory. But the real test isn't in declarations, it's in deterrence. And nowhere is that more visible than, we've had Poland, we've had Romania, and now we've also had Estonia's Tapa military base. Now, before I continue, I'm curious what you think about this. Is this just a case of we have to sort of continue as we are, or we actually need to see some kind of immediate, kinetic reaction, not simply caution and diplomacy? Do stick around for this video, because I'm going to run through some realistic options NATO has left on the table and give my view on one of the more singular viable pathways forward. Now, Tapa, in case you weren't aware, literally translates as kill in Estonian, and it was once a Soviet airbase. Today, it's a symbol of defiance for the country and the Baltics more collectively, home to the Estonian army and NATO's battle group, which is led by Britain. You can find the Royal Tank Regiment, which has recently deployed Challenger 2 tanks, the Archer artillery system, and Griffith armoured personnel carriers. French forces are also integrated into the command alongside Estonia's. And if, therefore, Russia ever tried to roll across the border, these forces would be the first to resist. And so with that in mind, we have to consider the hardline stance in how to respond. Now, if you're a regular on this channel, you'll know that I, reiterate this point quite a lot. People like Putin, strongmen, autocrats, they largely only recognize and respond to one thing: force. Now, in this case, if we don't, then we get repeated blatant airspace violations, which have to be dealt with differently than simply strong words of condemnation. A clear rule of engagement: warn, inform, and if an aircraft still crosses, it is shot down. That is an unmistakable message. And, there are previous examples of this. We can look to 2015, when Turkey famously enforced its own airspace rules. And Turkey is the second largest standing army NATO member, when it shot down, a Russian aircraft when it did not comply. The message was simple and effective: incur intrusion, risk destruction. For them, this certainty is an antidote to Moscow's probing. And this is not a neutral technical point. It is political, though. It requires allied consensus, legal cover, and the political will to accept the diplomatic and potential military consequences. Turkey was largely operating independently over Syrian airspace during military operations against ISIS and the rebels. But over Europe, including the main area of NATO, would be a little riskier. And so crucially, it assumes that the use of measured force, though, deters rather than escalates. And that is a bet, and a potentially dangerous one. So, of course, then there is the counter-argument, this continued fear of risk of escalation, that, if you use kinetic action, that risks an uncontrolled spiral. A down jet could provoke a tit for tat that quickly leaves the Baltic airspace dispute and heads towards a larger clash. Washington, especially, Worries about unintended escalation between nuclear armed powers, and as we've mentioned at the beginning, the British and French are the ones that could potentially be directly involved in a ground offensive. The dilemma is stark: respond forcibly and risk war, or show restraint but risk strategic defeat by, well, attrition. And the problem is that with America now seemingly willing to pull out its own presence in the Eastern Bloc, well, this means Europe has to consider this option even more delicately than it did. Now, at the heart of the Kremlin's calculations is a very modern variable: uncertainty about Washington's response. The US provides about 40% of NATO's military capacity in Europe, and American forces, particularly artillery units like HIMARS, air power, planners, and logistics, are central to any form of longer-term deterrence. But political leadership also matters. Nobody is naive about the reality that an American president who, well, now signals unpredictability, reluctance, or even cordiality with Putin risks, well, changing that calculus. Inside NATO, there are awkward conversations, blunt ones, about planning for the possibility that the US just, well, might not just react in response, but not even be there at all. So if policymakers take this worst case scenario, then the US might be unreliable in any form of crisis, then the answer is quite obvious. Europe needs the ability to act independently and fast, a point that I keep emphasizing on this channel, not because of a criticism about sort of Europe's ineptitudes, but because things are not going to get any easier for the continent with two, well, seemingly very chummy strongmen on either side of them. And so that means more than words. It means a credible common deterrent. Things like integrated air defenses, offensive air power, munition stockpiles, and precision strike options under a European command system. It also means joint planning, logistics, and the ability to sustain operations without any guarantee of an American backdrop. Now, to many, this is quite achievable. If the Europeans can put their act together, then it would be quite easy to mount a decent deterrent, and that Russia's any air campaign or engagement wouldn't really last that very long because it's just the sheer quantity and disproportionality between the two sides involved. That said, turning confidence into capability does require investment, industrial base resilience, political unity, and, well, political capital most of all. Things that the EU and NATO without the US must accelerate, but equally, well, looks difficult to because of the cumbersome size of both groups. One of the clearest lessons of this is that Ukraine has reinvented itself and modern warfare, especially in the skies. And so to many, there is a strategic case here for there to be a closer cooperation between NATO forces on the eastern flank and Ukrainian units who can effectively teach some units there how to respond more consistently and sustainably. Training together, sharing tactics, and learning from Ukraine's battlefield experiences, of which they have the most recent of any country realistically, would be very, very beneficial to NATO's eastern flank. They have valuable lessons about integrated air-land operations, for example, and improvisation under sanctions, and fighting against a much larger but seemingly structurally weaker opponent. NATO troops in the Baltics must, train with their Ukrainian counterparts, not merely as symbolic gestures, but as practical preparation. As you've heard me say many times before, it's unlikely that this war will be determined on the battlefield. It will be determined by events that happen off it, politically, economically, especially with Russia's situation. And, well, the continued strikes by Ukrainian air forces on oil refineries is certainly turning up that pressure. There is a grim logic here, basically, that the targeted strikes on the economic and industrial bases can degrade a belligerent's capacity to wage the war. And some even suggest that a campaign of destruction against strategic infrastructure would coerce Moscow even quicker to some kind of negotiation. Striking economic infrastructure risks civilian hardship and escalation, and maybe rallying around the flag effect because they think that, well, Putin is the only one who can protect them from these external attacks. Or, if done effectively enough, they realize that Putin is not the protector and upholder of the great Russia he has claimed to be. The idea of corruption, poor logistics, and moral problems really begin to dog the Russian side. Moscow has struggled to achieve decisive breakthroughs, and Ukraine's campaign against refineries and the infrastructure has bitten into Russia's economic lifelines very significantly. The most effective pressure could come from within the Russian area, sabotaging organizing resistances and the empowerment of Russian opponents of the Kremlin, something we've seen multiple times throughout history, such as the Decembrists in the 1820s. Encouraging and protecting internal dissent and helping dissidents with information, safe havens, and even channels to act is a politically delicate but strategically potent lever that NATO could quite effectively leverage if done with some thought. So where does this leave us then? The politics is ugly and the contingency planning is urgent. Putin is probing because he perceives openings, political uncertainty in Washington, slow-moving defense integration from the Europeans, and the continued pressure of war in Ukraine that forces hard choices on Moscow. Now, in many ways, you could argue that the hardline approach is really the one to pursue at this point. Putin is unlikely to be able to respond to jets being shot down over sovereign state airspace, even if he doesn't recognize them as sovereign airspace. It's very unlikely that Chinese or the Indians would really support the continued recklessness of the Russian government in such actions. And ultimately, you have to remember that these provocations are not a symbolism of someone who has ultimate control over the battlefield in Ukraine. If Putin did, he wouldn't resort to such measures. Therefore, he's doing this because he's running out of options. He is having to, try to distract other NATO members who support Ukraine with their own issues so that it can weaken Ukrainians' defense and, benefit Moscow on the battlefield. And so this means that there is a strategic path that is visible. Accelerate European defense autonomy, deepen practical cooperation with Ukraine, and apply the continued economic, but also encourage greater internal political pressure on the Kremlin. There are no easy options, and none of these are going to be quick, but decisive action requires political courage, and restraint invites potential further probing. The hard truth is that NATO's credibility now hangs on the Baltics. If Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or even Poland ever feel abandoned, that entire post-1945 security order is largely, hanging by tatters. Putin is testing not for that immediate conquest, but to see whether the West believes its own promises. And if Europe can step up rapidly, coherently, and with the instruments of enforced deterrence, then the Baltics will be secure. Russia's options will shrink even more. And if not, the Kremlin will continue to probe, exploit cracks, and try to fracture the alliance at a time when it's already being done so by a big orange guy in the White House. But what do you think? Should a NATO ally shoot down a Russian jet at this point? Or does risking escalation still mean something we can't afford? Tell me your views in the comments. Well, if you enjoyed this take, then do consider subscribing and joining me in the future videos. If you don't know me, my name is Pyotr Kurzin. I am half English, half Russian, having been brought up in the West, but with a lot of influences and living in Russia as well. And I've got my master's degree from Johns Hopkins SAIS in the US, with years of experience working on geopolitics, strategy, and economics. So I try to reflect that in what I talk about and how I talk about it on this channel, including the guests that I interview, from diplomats, analysts, activists, and economists on all areas related to Russia, Ukraine, but also the globe. I hope to see you in the future ones. Take care.